So first up we have this man, Simon Leviev, the scammer from the Tinder Swindler. What first caught my attention about his face is that his jawline is quite subpar. As you can see, it just appears too rounded and lacks any sharp masculine angles. So ideally, when taking a look at the model's face, his jawline is a lot more square and rigid, which gives a far more masculine and high testosterone appearance. The second flaw I picked up on is that it seems his ramus is too short. So for those who don't know, the ramus is this near vertical piece of bone connected to the jawline which is beneath the ear. And ideally it should be longer rather than shorter as we see with Simon Leviev. Related to this, his next flaw is that it seems his gonian angle is too steep. The ideal angle falls anywhere in the vicinity of 115 degrees. Meanwhile, when we take a look at Simon Leviev's, his is far too steep, coming in at 145 degrees. His last flaw related to his jawline is that it seems he also has a narrowing lower third. As you can see, the lower part of his face diverges in a little, when ideally all facial thirds should be completely straight and equal. Next flaw, it seems his lips are a fraction too thin, or maybe just a little bit oddly shaped. Now taking a look at his eye area. And just at first glance, you can see almost straight away, his eyes just aren't as piercing as the model has here. I believe this is partially related to a combination of three flaws, which I like to call OCE, which stands for orbits, cheekbones, eye bags. And as you'll see, these three things are all linked to one another. So taking a look at this man's eyes, he has large and rounded eye orbits, when ideally they should be more squarish and compact. Next, he noticeably has lower set cheekbones compared to the ideal, which are higher set and closer towards the eye. And finally, this man having these two things tied together are causing him to have significant eye bag deposits beneath his eye. And the point is, I think Simon Leviev also has a combination of these three flaws, at least to some degree, which is causing his eye area to have a more preyish appearance. Now, of course, his isn't anywhere close to being as bad as this guy has here, but still, Mr. Leviev's is far away from being as ideal as the male models. His next flaw is that he has a little bit of upper eyelid exposure on show, which again adds to his preyish eye area, because ideally there should be minimal or no upper eyelid exposure on show. Flaws to do with other parts of his face, it seems his mid-face ratio is a bit off. His mid-face ratio, which is the comparison of the length between his upper lip and eyes, with the distance between his two pupils. His mid-face ratio comes in at 1.1 to 1, which typically gives a longer, less masculine face compared to the ideal of having a straight 1-to-1 ratio. For his next flaw, I want to say a couple things about the shape of his nose. I believe there are a few issues going on here. Firstly, it seems his nasal tip is drooping downwards a little. From the side angle, his nose seems a bit too curved or hooked. And again, going back to the front, the end of his nose seems a bit too bulging and protruding. Finally, his last flaw is that his hairline appears a bit too curved. So as you can see, it lacks the squared off shape that we see on the male models. But with this said, I don't think his hairline is receding. So with all of these flaws taken into account, my final face rating for Simon Leviev is a 6 out of 10. I believe he's slightly above average looking. And usually I say a few positives, but the thing about this guy is that literally everything about his face is just below the threshold of being ideal. I mean, every single one of these is a really minor and nitpicky flaw, but they all add up, which gets my rating of 6. And to attest to this argument, with a few minor tweaks, just take a look at this photo of him. These subtle edits can show how close the difference can be between a plain old 6 and a high 7 pushing 8. The last thing I'm going to say is there's probably a lot of you thinking, well, if he's only a 6, how did he get so many women to hand such significant amounts of money to him? Shouldn't only a Chad be able to get away with this? Well, it should be fairly obvious. Clearly his looks wasn't his primary attractor. Rather, he was relying on the portrayal of riches and high status to do the heavy lifting. If he was poor, No women would be looking in his direction, and they certainly wouldn't be thinking of lending him any money. So that's my summary of Simon Lviv. If you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, be sure to press the like button now and leave any thoughts you have in the comments below, as it helps the YouTube algorithm. Now moving on to person 2, Lee Chung-chae, who plays contestant number 456 in the Netflix show Squid Game. This time, let's first take a look at a few positives. He has a straight mandible with reasonably decent definition and good forward growth. Probably his best feature is his eyes. He has the ideal almond shape, which I've spoken about so many times in my previous videos. This is what predominantly gives him that smouldering look. Adding to this smouldering look also helps the fact that his eyebrows are ideally shaped. They are the ideal flattened curve shape, which you can see both here and on the male models. Another positive is the shape of his hairline. It's fairly squared off at the corners, and despite his age being 49 years old, shows absolutely no signs of receding. This is very good because in my video where I analysed 1,000 faces, who were all customers of my Fiverr rating service, out of the 38 guys who were over the age of 40, 23 of them were balding at a level of Norwood 3 or more, which is almost 2/3. So nearly 2/3 of guys over 40 have a hairline either equal or worse to this one here. This is a Norwood 3 hairline where it's clear to see the recession. In a couple minutes I'm going to analyse the face of Penn Badgley, who only has a Norwood 2 hairline. Not many people would recognise this as balding unless they watch my or other similar content creators' channels. Anyway, on top of his hairline being good, he also has excellent hair texture. Now, of course, if he's in the filming industry, he might have certain products or treatment being used. But either way, in these photos, his hair texture still looks good and natural with a good thickness as well. Now moving on to the flaws. The first thing that should be very noticeable, because we've already talked about it, is his mid-face ratio. So we've already established that the ideal is a 1:1 ratio. Simon Lviv had a longer ratio of 1.1:1, meanwhile Chung-chae's is even worse at 1.15:1. This clearly gives him a long face appearance. Similarly again to Simon Lviv, his lips are also thin. And once more, I would also say these are worse than Simon Lviv's. Wrapping up the similarities of Simon Lviv, he also has a short ramus, but I don't think this is as bad as Simon's is. Next flaw, which is honestly the main downfall of his eyes, is that he has significant lower eyelid exposure beneath them, a prominent sign of aging. His philtrum, which is this little bit of skin here, is quite long. His philtrum to chin ratio is 1:2, when the ideal is at least 1:2.5, closer to 1:3. He shows further signs of aging. Wrinkles are starting to form around his eyes, he's starting to develop skin folds, and as a whole his skin seems to be losing its elasticity, causing his face to sag in various areas. Finally, his ears also seem to be a bit protruding. With all of these taken into account, both the positives and negatives, my final rating for him is a 5 out of 10. But I'd say he's a lot closer to being a 4 than a 6. And now I've got 2 of the 3 stars out of the way, I'm going to now take this opportunity to ask if you, the audience member, like this style of analysis enough and want to see where you yourself stack up. If this is the case, check out my Fiverr page where I provide rating and analysis services at a fair price. There are 3 packages available and a link will be the first in the description box below. Now moving on to person number 3, Penn Badgley, who plays Creepy Man Joe from the Netflix show You. He also has a few positive features, so we'll first take a look at these. Like Chung-chae, he has a straight mandible with good forward growth. He also has a long ramus, and overall his jawline has good definition and is probably his best feature. His eyes are also quite aesthetic. He has positive canthal tilt, which is one of the 2 tilts that is seen as attractive, the other being neutral tilt, while the dreaded negative canthal tilt is seen as unattractive and is to be avoided. His eyebrows are also a good shape, however I do think they can be a little thicker and maybe a slightly darker colour. Carrying on with the positives, he has a compact mid-face, which again, as we've already established, has an ideal ratio of 1:1. His skin texture is very good. It's ever so slightly rough, which can add to a rugged and masculine appearance. And finally, I've also noticed he has very good facial symmetry, which is perhaps the most basic indicator out there of good health and genetics. Now taking a look at a few flaws. Similar to Chung Chae, he also has lower eyelid exposure. His eyebrows are a little too fine, which I've already said about. Now, I've selected these photos carefully because, as shown in this one where clearly he's a little bit older, you can see his balding is a lot more noticeable than in these two photos where he's maybe 3 to 5 years younger. You wouldn't even be able to tell he's balding in either of these two photos. But on this one, when you look closely, it's clear to see the recession has started. He has more aging related flaws which again are more noticeable in this image. The wrinkles on his forehead are more noticeable here than here. And I'm not 100% sure on this one, but it seems his hair might starting to be greying as well. But this might just be the way the light is reflecting off his hair in the picture. His neck is a little too thin, which quite obviously can make a man look weak. And lastly, he also has a small gap between his teeth. You can't see it in any of these photos, but it's just about visible in these two. So, with all of these things taken into account, my final rating for Penn Badgley is a 7 out of 10. I believe, despite the flaws, he is convincingly above average looking. Especially in these two photos when he's a bit younger, but he may have lost half a point to a point once the age-related factors are taken into account. Last thing I haven't mentioned is despite him being a 7, he lacks any striking qualities that would make his appearance unique and appealing to a small subset of girls. Like, he just looks a bit plain in the original. But in my opinion, the blue eyes make him more stand out and maybe bring him up to an 8.